The concrete was still curing when the first evacuation siren started. I remember that detail because I was standing barefoot on the warehouse floor at 2:14 in the morning, watching moisture bead across the surface of a freshly poured sub-level wall, and the sound came from so far away that I mistook it for a train horn. It wasn't. Nothing that followed was what I mistook it for. If you want to hear how this bunker went from vanity to necessity, please consider subscribing and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. My name is Adrien Coles. I was 41 years old, and I had spent the previous 11 months building something my ex-wife called a vanity crypt. She wasn't entirely wrong. The bunker beneath my warehouse on Stafford Industrial Lane in suburban Columbus, Ohio, was not a survival project in the way most people understood the term. I wasn't stockpiling ammunition or freeze-dried emergency rations in vacuum-sealed buckets. I was building a living space, a sealed, self-sustaining, architecturally deliberate living space 60 feet beneath a decommissioned furniture warehouse that I'd purchased with the proceeds of selling my stake in a commercial HVAC company. The money had been substantial. The divorce had been worse. The bunker was what I did instead of therapy. And it showed. Italian porcelain tile in the bathroom. A French press coffee station with a built-in grinder. LED circadian panels along the ceiling that mimic daylight cycles across 4 programmable seasons. I was building a place I actually wanted to live. Not a concrete coffin with canned beans and a shotgun. That distinction mattered to me. It would matter to everyone else soon enough. I had a crew of 3. Nolan Price, my foreman, was 56 and had poured foundations across the Midwest for 30 years. He thought I was eccentric but paid on time, which made him loyal in the only way tradespeople respect. His daughter, Meg, was 28 and ran logistics. Material orders, delivery coordination, permit management, with the terrifying efficiency of someone who'd been keeping her father's business solvent since she was 19. The third was Thomas Herrera, an electrician I'd subcontracted for the circadian panels and the air handling system, who was quietly the most talented person on the project and the least interested in conversation. He showed up at 7, worked until 4, and said maybe 30 words a day, 20 of which were measurements. The 4 of us were in the warehouse that night because we were behind schedule on the ventilation loop. The HEPA filtration stack I'd ordered from a medical-grade supplier in Michigan had arrived with incorrect housing dimensions, and Tomas had spent 2 days fabricating an adapter sleeve so we wouldn't lose another week. Nolan was helping him mount the unit. Meg was reconciling invoices at a folding table near the cargo bay. I was checking the curing walls because I couldn't sleep, and because the bunker was the only place my mind went quiet. The sirens faded. Then they came back, layered now, overlapping from different directions. Meg looked up from her laptop. "That's not a test," she said. She said it without alarm, the way she said most things. Factual, clipped, already 2 steps ahead of the reaction she wasn't going to have. She pulled out her phone and refreshed a local news feed. I watched her face change. Not dramatically, just a tightening around her eyes, a brief stillness before she turned the screen toward me. The headline was from a Columbus NBC affiliate. Governor declares state of emergency. Residents urged to shelter in place. Sources confirm coordinated military response to biological threat. Below it, a shaky cell phone video showed a parking lot outside a Kroger on East Broad Street. There were people on the ground. There were other people crouched over them. The footage cut before it showed what happened next. But what it showed was enough. Nolan came up the ladder from the sub-level, his knees cracking on every rung. He looked at me, then at Meg's phone, then back at me. "So," he said, "how sealed is sealed?" I didn't answer right away. I looked around my warehouse. The tool carts, the pallets of unused tile, the open cargo bay doors letting in the humid July air, and now, the distant sound of overlapping sirens. And I did something that felt absurd and completely rational at the same time. I walked over and pulled the cargo bay doors shut. The next 40 minutes were the most important of my life. and I spent them making a list. Not a survival list, an engineering audit. I stood at Meg's folding table with a legal pad and wrote down every system in the bunker, its completion status, and what it needed to become functional. Meg read items aloud from memory while I wrote. Nolan leaned against a support column and added corrections. Tomas kept working on the filtration mount because the sub-level structure itself was complete. 2,000 square feet of reinforced concrete, partitioned into a main living area, a bathroom with a composting toilet and a gravity-fed shower, a mechanical room housing the air handling system, and a storage wing I'd originally intended as a library. The Italian tile was half-laid. The circadian panels were wired but uncalibrated. The water system drew from a 2,000-gallon cistern I'd filled from the municipal line during construction, with a secondary input that Tomas had plumbed to collect condensation from the HVAC loop. That secondary system was theoretical. We'd never tested it. Power came from a dual-source setup, a battery bank charged by a solar array on the warehouse roof, and a propane generator with a 200-gallon tank. The solar was fully wired. The generator was connected, but had only been run once for testing. Ventilation was the weakest link. The HEPA stack Tomas was mounting would filter incoming air to surgical theater standards, but the intake ran up through the warehouse floor to a screened vent on the north wall. If anything compromised the warehouse itself, the intake could become a liability. I circled that item twice. The entrance to the bunker was a steel-reinforced hatch set into the warehouse floor, concealed beneath a section of industrial shelving that rolled on recessed tracks. From above, it looked like every other shelf unit in the building. Below the hatch, a vertical steel ladder dropped 18 feet to a pressure-equalized anteroom with a second hatch. I designed the double-hatch system not for zombies. I hadn't believed in zombies 11 months ago, but for tornado protection and atmospheric isolation. The inner hatch had a manual locking wheel and a rubber gasket rated for submarine-grade pressure differentials. When both hatches were sealed, the sublevel was airtight. Food, Meg said. She said it the way a surgeon says bleeding. The bunker had no food supply, because I hadn't reached that phase of outfitting. I'd been living on delivery Thai food and gas station coffee for the duration of construction. What we had was whatever was in the warehouse. A case of bottled water, a box of granola bars from Costco, Nolan's lunch cooler, and a bag of dried mango slices that Meg kept in her work bag. Enough for maybe 2 days if we were careful. The loading district, Nolan said. There's a restaurant supply wholesaler 3 blocks east. Franco's. They've got a walk-in full of dry goods. He knew this because he'd done renovation work for the owner 2 years ago. I didn't want to go outside. The sirens hadn't stopped, and through the warehouse walls I could now hear a second layer of sound. Car horns, constant and arrhythmic. The auditory signature of gridlocked panic. But Nolan was right. We couldn't seal ourselves underground with 2 days of granola bars and pretend that was a plan. The 4 of us drove in Nolan's truck. Meg navigated from the passenger seat using offline maps because cell service was already fragmenting. Tomas and I sat in the bed, and I saw my first infected person 3 blocks from the warehouse. She was standing in the median of Stafford Industrial, barefoot, wearing a hospital gown. She wasn't moving the way injured people move. She was swaying slightly, her head tilted at an angle that suggested the muscles in her neck were no longer responding to voluntary commands. Her mouth was open. Her eyes tracked the truck as we passed, and her body pivoted to follow us with a mechanical smoothness that made Tomas put his hand on my arm. "Don't stop," he said. The longest sentence he'd spoken in days. Franco's was dark, but unlocked. The owner was gone. We loaded the truck in 11 minutes. Canned goods, rice, dried pasta, cooking oil, salt, industrial containers of coffee, a case of powdered milk. Meg found a first aid cabinet and emptied it into a duffel. Nolan backed the truck to the loading dock with the headlights off because there were now more figures moving along the road, all with that same wrong smoothness, and none of them seemed drawn by sound as much as by light. We made it back to the warehouse and unloaded without speaking. The infected woman in the hospital gown had moved half a block closer to our building. She was standing near a fire hydrant, motionless now, her head cocked as if listening to something below the range of human hearing. I watched her from the gap in the cargo bay door, and for the first time, I allowed myself to understand that this wasn't a disruption. It was a replacement. We sealed the bunker at 4:07 a.m. I recorded the time because I had a feeling I would want to know later exactly when my life bifurcated. Above us, the warehouse sat dark and locked. Below, the four of us stood in a space that smelled like fresh concrete and machine oil, surrounded by stacked cans and unfinished tile work, and listened to the silence that comes from being 60 feet underground with 2 steel hatches between you and everything. Meg was the first to speak. "We need shifts," she said. "Monitoring, rationing, system checks. If we're going to be down here, we run it like a job." She'd already pulled out a notebook and was dividing the day into blocks. I recognized the impulse. It was the same one that drove me to build the bunker in the first place. When the world stops making sense, you build a structure inside it and live there instead. Nolan sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and rubbed his knees. He hadn't said much since we'd seen the woman in the hospital gown, and I could tell the silence was costing him something. Nolan was a talker. He narrated his own work, told the same 7 stories on rotation, filled every gap with noise the way his generation of tradesmen always did. The quiet meant he was frightened in a way that went past what talking could manage. Tomas was already inspecting the filtration mount. He'd brought his tool belt down and was tightening connections with the focused calm of someone who had decided that the apocalypse was a punch list. I envied him that. My own hands were shaking, and I hid them in my pockets like a teenager. The first 12 hours were organizational. Meg inventoried every item of food and calculated daily caloric allotments for 4 adults at sedentary activity levels. We had roughly 21 days of food if we held to 1,600 calories per person per day. Water was more comfortable. The cistern alone could sustain us for over 60 days at conservative consumption, and Tomas believed the condensation recovery system would extend that substantially once he completed the plumbing loop. Power was the most stable variable. The battery bank, fully charged from the solar array before we sealed, could run the air handling system and the LED panels for approximately 40 days without any solar input. If the array on the warehouse roof remained intact and unobstructed, the batteries would recharge indefinitely. I gave Meg the master bedroom, the only partitioned sleeping space with a door. It wasn't chivalry, it was management. Meg was the person most likely to keep us functional, and she needed real sleep to do it. Nolan took a cot in the storage wing, surrounded by shelves of canned tomatoes and rice. Tomas claimed a sleeping pad in the mechanical room, next to the equipment he was still calibrating. I slept on the couch in the main living area, which was a $1,200 Italian leather sectional I'd had delivered through the cargo hatch in pieces. It was the most comfortable surface in the bunker, and the most absurd object I'd ever purchased. Lying on it while the world ended felt like a punchline I couldn't quite hear. The circadian panels came online at hour 16. Tomas had calibrated them to a 12-hour cycle, 6 a.m. sunrise to 6 p.m. sunset, and the effect was startling. The bunker went from feeling like a basement to feeling like an interior room with excellent lighting. The color temperature shifted gradually from cool morning blue to warm afternoon amber, and when sunset mode engaged, the panels dimmed to a deep orange that made the concrete walls look almost like sandstone. Meg stood in the middle of the main room during the first simulated sunrise and closed her eyes and breathed in a way that told me she'd been holding something very tight inside her chest. "That helps," she said. More than I expected. It helped me too. I'd designed the system as a luxury feature, a way to prevent the circadian disruption that plagues underground living. Now, it was a psychological lifeline. We were sealed in a concrete box, cut off from daylight and wind and weather, and the panels gave our bodies permission to believe that time was still passing in the normal way. But the food math haunted me. 21 days was not a future. It was a countdown. On the second night, I told Meg I wanted to go back up. Meg didn't argue. She negotiated. "You don't go alone," she said. "And you don't go without a plan that I've approved." This was the dynamic that established itself naturally between us. Not leader and follower, but architect and auditor. I designed. She stress-tested. It worked because we both understood that my instincts were good and my judgment under pressure was unreliable, while her judgment was excellent, and her instincts were conservative to the point of paralysis. The plan was simple. Nolan and I would ascend through the hatches into the warehouse, exit through the personnel door on the south side, and move on foot to the commercial strip 3 blocks north. The target list was specific: a pharmacy, a hardware store, and a sporting goods outlet that Nolan believed carried camping cook stoves and fuel canisters. We'd carry backpacks and duffel bags. We'd stay no longer than 90 minutes. We'd return before the circadian panels shifted to afternoon mode so that Meg could track our timeline without radio contact. Since we had no radios, Tomas offered to come instead of Nolan. I said no. Tomas was irreplaceable underground. He was the only one who understood the mechanical systems well enough to repair them. Nolan was strong, knew the neighborhood, and had a steadiness under physical strain that his age concealed. He'd also brought a framing hammer from the warehouse that he carried with the casual competence of someone who'd been swinging one for 3 decades. We ascended at what the panels told us was 7 a.m. on day 3. The warehouse was dark and unchanged. Dust motes floated in the thin beams of light that came through the ventilation screens. The air smelled different from the bunker. Warmer, flatter, carrying a faint sourness that I later learned to associate with unattended organic decay. Grocery stores, restaurant kitchens, residential refrigerators. The entire cold chain had broken, and the city was beginning to rot from the inside. The personnel door opened onto a narrow alley between my warehouse and a plumbing supply depot. The alley was empty. The sky was overcast. The sirens had stopped. That absence was worse than their presence had been, because sirens mean someone is still responding. Silence means everyone has either succeeded or given up, and the smell in the air told me which one applied. We moved north along the back sides of buildings, staying off the main road. Nolan walked ahead by 6 paces. Not a tactical decision, just the natural spacing of a man who'd spent his life arriving at job sites before anyone else. The commercial strip appeared at the end of the alley. A Dollar General, a Subway, a CVS pharmacy, a True Value hardware store, and a Play It Again Sports. 2 of the 5 had broken front windows. A car was idling in the middle of the road, with both doors open and no one inside. I saw 3 infected people. They were standing in the Dollar General parking lot, spaced about 20 feet apart, facing different directions. Their stillness was the worst part. In the movies, zombies move. They shamble, they lunge, they swarm. These 3 were simply standing, weight evenly distributed. I saw arms at their sides, heads slightly tilted. They looked like mannequins, placed by someone who didn't quite understand human posture. One of them was a teenage boy in a soccer jersey. His eyes were open and tracking a plastic bag that the wind was pushing across the asphalt. He watched it with total attention, head swiveling smoothly, and when it caught against a curb and stopped, his attention released, and his gaze drifted upward to nothing. Nolan touched my elbow and pointed to the CVS. Its front door was closed. We circled to the back and found a service entrance that was locked but flimsy. Nolan put his shoulder into it once, and the latch gave. Inside, the pharmacy was dim and largely untouched. We filled 1 duffel with antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, bandages, antiseptic, and 3 bottles of prescription-strength sleep medication that I grabbed on instinct. Meg hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since we'd sealed. The front of the store gave us batteries, flashlights, and 4 prepaid cell phones still in packaging. I didn't know if cell networks were still active, but the phones had built-in FM radios, and FM transmitters could run on backup power for weeks. The True Value was already broken open. Someone had taken the weapons: axes, machetes, hunting knives. but left most of the practical inventory. We took duct tape, zip ties, a hand crank emergency radio, rope, 2 tarps, a box of N95 masks, and 10 pounds of assorted fasteners. Nolan found a come-along winch and strapped it to his pack. "Trust me," he said when I looked at it. I did. We were 40 minutes into the run. We hadn't been noticed. The infected in the parking lot remained static. I was beginning to feel something dangerous. The sense that this was manageable. Play it again. Sports yielded 2 camping stoves, a case of butane canisters, a water filtration pump, 4 sleeping bags, and a set of walkie-talkies with a 12-mile range. I tested a pair inside the store and got clear signal. That changed our operational capacity overnight. I clipped one to my belt. With a feeling close to joy, we leapt through the back of the sporting goods store and retraced our route south. The alley was still clear. The warehouse was still locked. We descended, sealed the hatches, and laid everything out on the main room floor like gifts under a tree. Meg surveyed the hall without expression. Then she picked up the walkie-talkies, examined them, and looked at me. "Now we can actually do this," she said. It was the first time I'd heard her voice carry anything beyond pragmatism. Days 4 through 10 were the period I think of as the build, not because we were constructing anything new, but because we were finally finishing what I'd started, transforming a luxury vanity project into something that could actually keep 4 people alive indefinitely. Tomas completed the condensation recovery system on day 5. It was elegant in the way that competent engineering always is. The HVAC loop's evaporator coils naturally produced condensate as they cooled, recirculated air, and Tomas routed that condensate through a charcoal filter into a secondary holding tank. The yield was modest, about 3 gallons per day, but it was renewable, and it meant our reliance on the cistern dropped by roughly 20%. He explained the system to me in the longest monologue I ever heard from him, nearly 200 words, and then went silent again for the rest of the day. The circadian panels became the emotional center of the bunker. We structured our entire daily rhythm around their cycle, waking with the simulated sunrise, eating meals at consistent times, dimming activity as the panels shifted toward evening amber. Meg created a schedule that included 2 hours of designated outside time each day, during which whoever wasn't on a surface run would sit in the main living area under full-spectrum light and do something that wasn't survival-related. Nolan read paperback westerns he'd found in the warehouse office. Meg sketched floor plans of the bunker with proposed modifications. Tomas listened to FM radio on one of the prepaid phones, scanning frequencies for broadcast signals. That radio became our only connection to the larger world. Most stations were dead air. 3 were running automated emergency loops, the same FEMA recording about sheltering in place, repeated every 8 minutes. But one station, 91.7, carried a live human voice. A woman who identified herself only as Ruth was broadcasting from what she said was a university radio station in Dayton, about 70 miles northeast. She spoke in a calm, unhurried cadence and delivered information without editorializing. Which highways were impassable, which military checkpoints were still manned, which cities had gone dark. She never speculated on the cause or the cure. She signed off every night at 10 with the same phrase: "Stay where you are if you're safe. Move carefully if you're not. I'll be here tomorrow." I looked forward to Ruth's broadcast with an intensity that embarrassed me. She was a stranger on a radio frequency, and her voice became the most important thing in my day. I think it was because she represented proof that someone out there was still choosing to be useful rather than just choosing to survive. The distinction mattered to me in a way I couldn't have articulated before the outbreak and couldn't stop thinking about after. On day 7, Nolan and I made a second surface run. This one was more ambitious. We drove his truck to a home improvement store on the far side of the industrial district, about 1.5 miles from the warehouse. The roads were worse. Abandoned vehicles formed choke points at every intersection. We saw more infected, maybe 24 total, scattered along the route in that same static posture. None of them reacted to the truck's engine noise, which confirmed what we'd tentatively observed. They responded to light and possibly body heat, but not sound. Nolan tested this by honking the horn twice at a cluster of 4 standing near a bus stop. Nothing. Not a flinch. The home improvement store was partially looted, but structurally intact. We took plywood sheets, sheet metal, screws, a portable welding kit, a solar battery charger, and 6 5-gallon buckets that I intended to use for a hydroponic growing system. Tomas had mentioned it offhandedly, that with the LED panels and a nutrient solution, we could grow leafy greens underground. And the idea had lodged in my brain like a splinter. The bunker wasn't just a shelter. It was an environment. And environments could be cultivated. We also found something I hadn't been looking for. In the garden section, untouched because no one fleeing for their life stops for seeds, I filled an entire bag with packets. Lettuce, spinach, basil, radishes, tomatoes, peppers. Nolan watched me sort through them with an expression I couldn't read. "You're planning to stay down there," he said. Not a question. "I'm planning to live down there," I said. "There's a difference." He didn't respond. But on the drive back, he was quieter than usual. And I realized that for Nolan, the bunker was still temporary, a place to wait until the real world reasserted itself. For me, it was already becoming the real world. And the surface was what was temporary. That divergence would matter. On day 12, Meg found the camera. It was in a box of miscellaneous electronics I'd stored in the warehouse office months ago. A digital handheld with a built-in microphone and a 128-gigabyte memory card. She brought it underground and set it on the kitchen counter without comment. I picked it up, turned it on, and looked at the lens. "We should be recording this," she said. "Not for content, for evidence. Someone is going to want to know what happened down here." She was right. And the camera changed something I didn't expect. It changed how I narrated my own experience to myself. Before the camera, the days blurred together. Wake, eat, check systems, listen to Ruth, eat, sleep. After the camera, I began describing things, noticing details, thinking about what mattered enough to preserve. The camera made me a witness instead of just a survivor, and the difference was the difference between enduring time and inhabiting it. I recorded the bunker in full on day 13, walking through each room, explaining the systems, showing the tile work and the circadian panels, and the hydroponic trays that Thomas and I had assembled from the 5-gallon buckets. Lettuce seedlings were already emerging, pale green threads reaching toward the LED light. I held the camera close to them and said something I still remember. "This is the first thing I've built that's growing instead of just lasting." That was the day we heard the knocking. We were in the main living area. All 4 of us, afternoon light cycle, Nolan reading, Meg on the schedule, Thomas adjusting the HVAC airflow balance. The sound came through the upper hatch, not banging, knocking. Rhythmic, deliberate, human. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Someone was in the warehouse, standing on the concealed hatch, and asking to be let in. We froze. Meg reached for the walkie-talkie as if to call someone, then set it down because there was no one to call. Nolan stood and positioned himself near the hatch ladder. Tomas turned off the HVAC system so we could hear more clearly. The knocking came again. Then a voice, muffled through steel and concrete, but distinctly female. "I know someone's down there. I saw the solar panels on your roof. Please, I have a child with me." Nolan looked at me. Meg looked at me. Thomas looked at the hatch. The decision was mine because it was my bunker, and the weight of that ownership landed on me like a physical thing. "We don't know her," Meg said. "We don't know what's up there. She has a kid," Nolan said. And in 2 words, he made the moral calculus that Meg and I were trying to avoid. A child changes the equation. A child makes refusal feel like something you can't recover from, regardless of the risk. I climbed the ladder and pressed my ear to the inner hatch. "How many are you?" I asked. "2," the voice said. "Me and my daughter. She's 6. We've been walking for 2 days. Please." I opened the outer hatch. The woman was kneeling on the warehouse floor, holding a small girl against her chest. She was maybe 30, black, wearing a hospital lanyard around her neck, and sneakers with no laces. The girl's face was buried in her mother's shoulder. Behind them, the warehouse was still dark and still empty. No infected, no followers. Her name was Diane Osei. Her daughter was Yara. Diane was a respiratory therapist at Mount Carmel East, and she'd walked 9 miles from the hospital after it was overrun on day 8. She'd survived because she understood airborne pathogens, because she'd masked Yara before the ventilation system distributed the infection through the building, and because she'd had the presence of mind to leave through a fire exit while everyone else barricaded the main doors. I helped them down the ladder. Meg recalculated the food supply. Thomas adjusted the air handling capacity. Nolan gave Yara his sleeping bag and a granola bar, and sat with her in the storage wing, telling her one of his 7 stories in a voice so gentle it made my chest hurt. 6 people now. The math got harder. Everything else got more human. Diane changed the bunker's internal ecology the way a new element changes a chemical compound. Not by addition, but by transformation. She was trained in respiratory care, which meant she understood air quality, filtration, contamination vectors, and the invisible ways that sealed environments kill you. Within 3 days of her arrival, she'd audited every component of the ventilation system, identified 2 potential failure points Tomas hadn't considered, and established a daily air quality check using a pulse oximeter she'd carried in her scrub pocket from the hospital. She also brought information. Real, clinical, first-hand information about how the infection worked. At Mount Carmel, she'd watched it move through a 600-bed hospital in less than 48 hours. It was respiratory. Not a bite, not a scratch, not the Hollywood fantasy of fluid transmission. It was airborne, carried in exhaled particles, and it attacked the prefrontal cortex before any other system. The infected didn't die first and reanimate. They lost volition. Higher cognition dissolved over a period of hours, while autonomic function, breathing, heartbeat, basic motor control, remained intact. What was left wasn't dead. It was emptied. A human body running on brainstem alone, responsive to light and heat because those were the stimuli that the oldest part of the brain still processed. "They're not hunting," Diane told us, sitting on the floor of the main room while Yara slept on the couch under Nolan's sleeping bag. "They're orienting, like sunflowers. They turn toward the strongest stimulus, and they stay there until something stronger pulls them away." This explained the static posture, the parking lot clusters, the way they watched light move but ignored sound. It also explained something more disturbing, why they occasionally surged. Diane had seen it at the hospital. 100 infected standing motionless in a corridor, and then a door opens at the far end, and the overhead fluorescents catch a reflective surface, and suddenly every one of them is moving toward it. Not running, but walking with that mechanical smoothness, converging. "How long before they degrade?" Meg asked. She meant physically. Bodies that don't eat or drink or seek shelter will eventually fail. Diane shook her head. "I don't know. At the hospital, some of them were still standing after 4 days without water. The metabolic rate seems to drop. Almost like hibernation. They're not using energy the way we do." She paused. "They could last months. Maybe longer if they get rain." That information restructured everything. We'd been operating on an implicit assumption that the infected would thin out, that exposure, dehydration, and physical deterioration would gradually clear the surface. Diane's clinical assessment suggested otherwise. The surface wasn't going to improve. The infected weren't a wave that would pass. They were a permanent change in the environment. I looked at my bunker differently after that conversation. The Italian tile, the circadian panels, the leather couch. I'd built a luxury space because I'd wanted to live beautifully underground. Now I realized I might be living underground for the rest of my life, and beautiful wasn't the same as sustainable. Beautiful was what you built when you assumed you'd eventually leave. Nolan handled the news the worst. Not visibly. He still rose with the simulated sunrise, still did his tasks, still told stories to Yara in the evenings. But his energy shifted. He moved slower. He asked fewer questions. He stopped volunteering for surface runs. Meg noticed before I did and brought it to me privately, standing in the mechanical room while Thomas pretended not to listen. "He's grieving," she said. "He had a life up there, an apartment, friends, a routine. He hasn't said it, but he's figured out that none of it is coming back." "He has you," I said. "That's not the same thing, and you know it." She crossed her arms. "He's 56 years old. He's in a concrete box with his daughter and 3 people he'd never have chosen to spend this much time with. He's allowed to be sad." She was right. I was so consumed by the mechanics of survival, the systems, the supplies, the hydroponic lettuce, that I'd missed the emotional decay happening 10 feet from me. The bunker could sustain our bodies. It could regulate our light exposure and filter our air and recycle our water. It could not address the slow internal collapse that happens when a person realizes that everything they built their identity around no longer exists. I sat with Nolan that evening in the storage wing. I didn't try to be therapeutic. I just asked him about the house he'd grown up in. He talked for an hour. The bunker was very quiet around us. Day 20 brought the first serious failure. The propane generator, which we'd been running for 2 hours each evening to supplement the battery bank, began emitting an irregular knocking sound from the combustion chamber. Tomas pulled it apart and found a cracked piston ring. Without replacement parts, the generator was unreliable at best, a carbon monoxide risk at worst. He shut it down and told me plainly, we were now entirely dependent on solar. The battery bank could run our essential systems for 40 days without input, but with the circadian panels, the HVAC, the LED grow lights, and the occasional hot water cycle, our daily draw exceeded what I'd calculated during construction. Tomas estimated we had 26 days of stored power if the solar array continued charging during daylight hours. If anything blocked the array, storm debris, fallen branches, accumulated dust, an infected person standing on the roof. The clock started. "We need to go up and inspect the panels," Tomas said. It was the most proactive suggestion he'd ever made. And it scared me because it meant he was worried enough to volunteer. I went up alone the next morning, not because I was brave, but because the roof access was a narrow exterior ladder on the warehouse's north face, and I was the lightest adult in the group. I ascended in the gray early light, the walkie-talkie clipped to my belt, Meg monitoring from below. The roof was flat, tarred, and covered in a thin layer of grit. The solar array occupied the southeast quadrant. 16 panels angled south, wired in series to a junction box that fed down through a conduit to the battery bank below. The panels were intact. No debris, no obstruction, no damage. The connections were clean. The array was performing as designed. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt exposed. The roof was the highest point in the immediate area, and from the parapet, I could see the surrounding blocks in every direction. What I saw reordered my understanding of our situation. The industrial district was still mostly empty of infected, but to the north, toward the residential neighborhoods, the density changed. I could see dozens of figures standing in roads, on sidewalks, in parking lots. Some were alone. Some stood in loose clusters of 4 or 5. Beyond them, toward downtown, a haze hung in the air that might have been fog, but carried a yellow tint that suggested something burning. There was no movement among the infected. They were simply there, distributed across the landscape like static sentinels, their faces turned toward whatever stimulus had last caught their attention. I counted the ones I could see. I stopped at 80 and put the binoculars down, because the number was already too large to be useful, and the counting itself was becoming its own form of panic. I descended, sealed the hatches, and told Meg what I'd seen. She added it to her notebook without visible reaction. But her handwriting was tighter than usual. That afternoon, Yara spoke to me for the first time. She'd been almost entirely silent since arriving, communicating with Diane through gestures and whispers. But she walked up to where I was adjusting the grow light height over the hydroponic trays and stood beside me, watching the lettuce seedlings. "Are those real?" she asked. "They're real," I said. "They're lettuce. They'll be big enough to eat in about 2 weeks." She touched one of the leaves with her fingertip, so gently it barely moved. "My school had a garden," she said. "We grew beans." Then she walked away and climbed back onto the couch, and Diane looked at me from across the room with an expression that contained more gratitude than any words could have carried. The lettuce was growing. The radishes were germinating. The basil was still dormant, but Tomas had adjusted the light spectrum and was optimistic. I realized that the hydroponic system had become something more than a food source. It was proof of continuity. Things were growing. In a sealed concrete box 60 feet underground, life was reaching toward artificial light and converting nutrient water into leaves, and that process felt like a counter-argument to everything happening on the surface. I added a second row of trays using materials from the hardware run. 12 growing positions now, enough to produce a small but continuous supply of fresh greens. Not enough to replace our canned provisions, but enough to supplement them with something that was alive. Something that had texture and color and the faint green smell of chlorophyll. Meg added garden maintenance to the daily schedule. Yara requested that it be her job. Ruth stopped broadcasting on day 24. The FM frequency went to static at 9:47 p.m. Mid-sentence, during a report about military withdrawal from the Cincinnati corridor. She'd been saying something about bridge demolitions, and then there was nothing. We sat around the radio and waited. We waited for an hour. The static didn't break. Nolan turned the radio off and went to his cot without speaking. Diane held Yara closer, though Yara was already asleep. Tomas stayed in the mechanical room. Meg and I sat in the main living area under the dimming circadian panels. And for the first time since the outbreak, I felt something beyond fear or determination or logistical focus. I felt grief, not for Ruth specifically. I'd never met her. Didn't know her real name. Couldn't picture her face. But for the voice, for the reliable proof that someone out there was choosing to broadcast instead of hiding. That was gone now. And its absence was a form of darkness that the circadian panels couldn't touch. "I need to tell you something," Meg said. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, knees drawn up, notebook in her lap. "The food projections are wrong. Not by a lot, but enough to matter." She showed me the numbers. When Diane and Yara arrived, she'd recalculated for 6 people and estimated 38 days at reduced rations, but she'd based that on the caloric content listed on the canned goods, which assumed standard serving sizes. Actual consumption, measured over 17 days of careful tracking, was running about 12% above projection because stress increases metabolic demand, and because Yara, though small, was a growing child whose caloric needs were proportionally higher than an adult's. "We have 22 days of food," Meg said, "not 38. 22 days. The number dropped into my chest like a stone. We could stretch it. Further reduce portions, prioritize caloric density, hope the hydroponics came in faster. But the math was final. Without resupply, we would run out of food before the bunker's other systems showed any strain. "We need a sustained source," I said. "Not more runs. A source." Meg nodded. She'd already been thinking about it. "There's a distribution warehouse on Route 33, about 6 miles south. Franco's was a storefront. This place is regional supply. Pallets, not shelves. If it hasn't been cleared out, there could be enough to last us through winter and beyond." 6 miles was the problem. Our previous runs had been within a half-mile radius, quick enough to complete in under 2 hours, close enough that the risk was bounded. 6 miles meant driving through extended sections of the residential commercial transition zone where I'd seen the highest infected density from the roof. It meant fuel consumption from Nolan's truck, which had less than a quarter tank. It meant being exposed for hours instead of minutes. "I'll map it," Meg said. "Every route option. We'll find the lowest density corridor." She paused. "But Adrien, we can't keep sending you and my father. He's not fast enough anymore, and you're not expendable. If this goes wrong, I'll go with Thomas," I said. "Tomas can't leave. If something happens to the HVAC while he's gone, then who?" She closed the notebook. "Me." The argument lasted an hour. I told her she was more valuable underground. She told me value wasn't measured by who stayed safe. I told her Nolan would never allow it. She told me her father didn't get to allow or disallow her decisions, and that framing it that way was exactly the kind of thinking that would get us killed. The assumption that protection meant containment. She was right. She was almost always right. That was the exhausting thing about Meg Price. Her competence wasn't just functional. It was moral. She saw clearly not just what needed to happen, but what it meant. And she refused to let sentiment distort the calculation. We agreed to go together. Meg and I. Day 26, Route 33 South, through the industrial corridor, avoiding the residential zones. Walkie-talkie contact every 15 minutes. Return by midday, regardless of outcome. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the leather couch under the fading amber of simulated dusk and stared at the concrete ceiling and listened to 6 people breathing in a sealed box underground. And I thought about the fact that I had built this place to escape my life, and now my life was the only thing happening inside it. We left at simulated dawn. Day 26. The warehouse was cold. Mid-autumn settling into the unheated space. Meg wore a canvas jacket over layers and carried a backpack frame designed for hauling weight. I carried a second pack and a pry bar. We both had walkie-talkies, and Nolan monitored from the bunker with the third unit. His voice on the channel was steady but compressed, each word carrying the careful control of a father watching his daughter walk into uncertainty. Nolan's truck started on the second attempt. The fuel gauge read just below a quarter. Meg had calculated the round trip at 12 miles plus margin for detours, and the truck got roughly 15 miles per gallon in mixed driving. We had enough fuel, barely. The industrial corridor was empty for the first 2 miles. Warehouses, storage lots, equipment yards. All dark, all abandoned, none harboring infected. The road surface was cluttered with debris, but passable. I drove slowly, keeping under 20 miles per hour. The engine noise swallowed by the open space around us. Meg navigated from her hand-drawn map, referencing landmarks rather than street signs because several signs had fallen or been obscured. At mile 3, we entered the transition zone. This was where the industrial district met the outer ring of commercial development. Strip malls, gas stations, fast food chains, and people, former people. I counted 14 infected visible from the road, standing in their characteristic postures among the abandoned cars and shuttered storefronts. They didn't react to the truck. We passed within 30 feet of a man standing beside a Taco Bell dumpster, and his eyes tracked us with that slow, mechanical pivot, but his body didn't follow. "They're thinner," Meg said quietly. She was right. 3 weeks into the outbreak, the infected showed visible deterioration, cheeks hollowed, clothing looser, skin carrying a grayish undertone. Diane's assessment about reduced metabolic rates might have been accurate. But metabolism couldn't be reduced to 0. They were consuming themselves, slowly, standing in the rain and the sun and the cooling autumn air while their bodies burned through reserves that would eventually deplete. How long that took was the question none of us could answer. The distribution warehouse appeared at mile 5.8. It was a massive corrugated steel structure set back from Route 33 behind a chain-link fence, with a paved yard that could accommodate a dozen semi-trucks. 2 trailers were still backed up to the loading docks, their cargo doors open. The fence gate was closed but not locked. I pulled the truck through and parked near the nearest loading dock. We sat in the cab for 3 full minutes, watching, listening. The walkie-talkie crackled. "Status," Nolan said. "On site," Meg replied. "Holding for observation." Nothing moved. The warehouse's main personnel door was ajar. No sound from inside. No infected visible in the yard or along the fence line. The only movement was a sheet of plastic caught on the fence, fluttering in a wind that carried the same sour decay smell that had become the ambient perfume of the surface world. We entered through the personnel door, pry bar raised, and found what we'd hoped for. The warehouse was a regional food distributor. Shelves stacked to the ceiling with palletized goods, canned vegetables, canned fruit, rice in 50-pound bags, dried beans, powdered milk, cooking oil in gallon jugs, instant coffee in institutional containers. The scale was staggering. This single building held enough preserved food to sustain our group for years. The realization hit me physically. I put my hand on a pallet of canned tomatoes and felt the weight of it, and something released in my chest that I'd been carrying since Meg showed me the 22-day projection. We weren't going to starve. The food existed. The problem was now transportation, not scarcity. We loaded the truck as fast as we could work. Priority items first. Caloric density, variety, medical supplements. Meg had a list ranked by nutritional value per pound, and she directed the loading with the same crisp efficiency she brought to everything. I carried, stacked, secured. We filled the truck bed, the back seat, the passenger footwell. We strapped a tarp over the bed to prevent anything from shifting. 40 minutes. We could have taken more, but the timeline mattered. I radioed Nolan. "Loaded, returning. Copy. Route clear?" His voice was tighter now. Waiting was harder than going. Meg checked the map. Same route back. No reason to deviate. We drove out through the gate, turned north on Route 33, and made it exactly 1 mile before we saw the convoy. 3 vehicles. A lifted pickup, a panel van, and a flatbed. Parked across both lanes of the road in a deliberate blockade. 5 people stood in front of them. Armed. Not infected. Alive, alert, and positioned with the clear intentionality of people who'd been doing this for a while. I stopped the truck 200 feet from the blockade. Meg's hand went to the walkie-talkie, hesitated, then pulled back, broadcasting our position and the existence of our bunker over an open radio channel with strangers this close was a risk she calculated and rejected in under a second. The 5 figures didn't advance. They waited. One of them, tall, lean, wearing a high-visibility vest over a flannel shirt, raised a hand. Not a wave, a summons. "We go through or we go around," I said. "There's no around," Meg replied. She was reading the terrain. Route 33 was bordered by drainage ditches on both sides, too deep for the truck to cross without bottoming out. The nearest cross street was behind us, nearly a mile back. Reversing would take time we'd spend in full view. "Then we talk." I put the truck in park and opened the door. "Adrien, stay in the cab. If this goes wrong, you drive." I handed her the keys. She took them without argument, which told me she'd already run the scenario and reached the same conclusion. I walked toward the blockade with the pry bar in my hand. Held low and visible, non-threatening but present, the man in the high-vis vest stepped forward to meet me. He was maybe 45, sunburned, with a week's beard and calm blue eyes that tracked me without anxiety. He carried a hunting rifle slung over one shoulder, but hadn't touched it. "Morning," he said. "Name's Ward. You're coming from the distribution center." Not a question. He'd been watching it. Maybe watching it for days. "We took what we needed," I said. "There's plenty left." "There is," he agreed. "And we'd rather not have to go get it ourselves every time. Coordination beats competition. That's our philosophy." Behind him, the other 4 watched. 2 men, 2 women. One of the women held a shotgun at port arms. The others had holstered sidearms. Their vehicles were loaded with supplies of their own. Not from the distribution center, by the look of it. Building materials, fuel cans, solar panels, and cardboard sleeves. Where are you based? I asked. South of here. Old County Fairground. Good perimeter, open sight lines, well water. He smiled. We've got about 30 people, growing every week. 30 people was a settlement, an organized one, from the sound of it. The solar panels and building materials suggested long-term planning. The roadblock suggested territorial awareness. Both of these things could be either very good or very dangerous, and I couldn't tell which from a 2-minute conversation on a highway. We're not looking for a group, I said. Nobody is, at first. Ward glanced past me at the truck, at the loaded bed under the tarp. That's a lot of food for one person. There are more of us. How many? I didn't answer. Meg had taught me that. Never quantify your group to an outsider. Numbers are vulnerability data. Ward nodded, as if my silence confirmed something. Look, I'm not here to take anything from you. We spotted the solar panels on a warehouse roof about a week ago. Unusual installation. Residential grade array on a commercial building. Somebody's living in there or under it. We've been keeping distance, watching. When you drove out this morning, we figured today was the day to introduce ourselves. They'd been watching us. For a week. They'd seen the solar panels, noted the truck, tracked our route to the distribution warehouse, and set up this meeting at a point where we'd be loaded with supplies and on a road with no alternate route. Every element was deliberate. This wasn't a greeting. It was a demonstration of capability. What do you want? I asked. Trade, information exchange, maybe mutual aid down the road. Winter's coming. It's going to be harder than people think. The infected don't seem to slow down in cold. If anything, they cluster for warmth. Groups that cooperate are going to last. Groups that don't. He shrugged. I studied his face. Nothing about it was threatening. Nothing about his tone was coercive. But the roadblock was coercion, regardless of the words layered over it. You don't demonstrate your ability to control someone's only escape route and then call it an introduction. I'll think about it, I said. Sure. Ward pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and held it out. Map to the fairground. Open invitation. Bring your people or don't. But know that we're there and we know you're here. And that's already a relationship whether either of us wants it to be. I took the paper. I walked back to the truck. The blockade vehicles reversed and cleared the road. We drove through the gap without stopping, and neither Meg nor I spoke for the entire drive back. In the warehouse, with the cargo bay sealed and the truck unloaded, I finally looked at the map. It was hand-drawn, detailed, annotated with distances and landmarks. Professional. The work of someone who valued precision. They've been watching us, I told the group. A settlement south of here. 30 people, organized, armed. They want to trade. Nolan's jaw tightened. Diane pulled Yara closer. Tomas set down his wrench. Meg took the map from my hand, studied it for 2 full minutes, and said the thing I'd been avoiding. The problem isn't whether they're trustworthy. The problem is that they found us, and we can't unfind ourselves. The days after the roadblock encounter were defined by a question we couldn't answer and couldn't stop discussing. What to do about Ward and his settlement. The conversation happened in fragments, over meals, during system checks, in the quiet pauses between tasks. And it split us along lines I hadn't anticipated. Nolan wanted nothing to do with them. His position was simple and immovable. Any group that establishes contact by blocking your road is a group that views you as a resource to be managed. The friendly language, the open invitation, the map. These were packaging. The product was leverage. We don't need 30 strangers knowing where we sleep, he said. We need to stay invisible. Diane disagreed, quietly but firmly. She'd worked in a hospital. She understood systems, supply chains, the fragility of isolation. 6 people can't sustain themselves forever, she said. Not medically, not genetically, not psychologically. We need a network eventually. The question is whether we choose one, or wait until one chooses us. The word genetically hung in the air after she said it. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the longest time horizon, that if this was permanent, our group of 6 was not a viable foundation for anything beyond our own lifespans. Meg was analytical. She'd mapped Ward's settlement location against our supply routes and identified 3 points of potential interdiction. If they chose to cut us off from the distribution warehouse, they could do it easily. If they chose to surveil the warehouse roof and track our solar output, which they'd already done, they could estimate our group size, power consumption, and operational patterns with alarming accuracy. Engagement isn't optional, she said. It's already happening. We're just deciding whether it's on our terms or theirs. Tomas said nothing. This was unusual even by his standards, because the silence wasn't productive. He wasn't working while he listened. He was sitting still, hands flat on his knees, staring at the wall. When I asked him directly what he thought, he said, "I've been in situations where bigger groups absorb smaller ones. It starts with trade. It ends with dependency. Then it ends with compliance." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. His history was something he'd never shared, and the way he said situations told me it lived in a place he'd decided not to open. I was the tiebreaker, and I didn't know where I stood. My instinct was Nolan's. Seal tight, stay hidden, protect what we'd built. But Diane's logic was unassailable. And Meg's operational assessment was correct. Invisibility was already gone. Ward knew our location, our vehicle, our approximate capability. The only variable we could still control was the nature of the relationship. On day 30, I made a decision. I would go to the fairground, alone, not to join, not to trade, not to commit, to observe, to gather information that would let us make a real choice instead of an emotional one. Meg opposed it, not the visit. The alone part. "You're the owner," she said. "You're the builder. If something happens to you, then you run this place better than I ever did," I said. "You already do." She looked at me for a long time. Then she handed me the walkie-talkie and said, "Check in every 30 minutes. Miss one check-in and I come after you in the truck." I left at dawn on day 31. The drive south took 40 minutes. The fairground appeared exactly where Ward's map said it would. A county fairground with a perimeter of chain-link fence, reinforced with stacked shipping containers. The gate was manned. 2 sentries with rifles waved me through after I identified myself. Ward met me inside. The settlement was real and functional. Garden plots, a communal kitchen, a medical tent staffed by a veterinarian who'd transitioned to human care, housing in the exhibition halls, a water pump drawing from a deep well, solar arrays, a workshop fabricating tools from salvaged materials. 32 people, organized, working, alive in a way that looked less like survival and more like civilization's rough draft. I spent 4 hours there. I ate a meal. I answered questions carefully and asked them freely. And I drove home with a feeling I couldn't name, something between admiration and fear, attraction and suspicion. The sense that I'd seen something real and couldn't tell whether it was a solution or a trap. I reported everything to the group that evening, seated around the main living area table under the circadian panel's amber shift. I described the fairground's layout, its resources, its people. I described Ward's operation in detail. The rotational work schedules, the communal food system, the defensive perimeter, the children playing in a fenced yard inside the compound. I described what I felt too, because I'd learned in the weeks underground that withholding my internal state from these 5 people was a form of dishonesty that corroded trust as effectively as lying. "It's impressive," I said, "and I don't trust it completely. Both things are true." The discussion that followed was the most important conversation we'd had since sealing the bunker. Not because it resolved anything, but because it exposed the fault line that had been running beneath us since day one. The bunker was my creation, but it wasn't my community. I'd built it for myself. The people inside it had arrived by circumstance, not invitation. And the decisions about its future couldn't be made by the person who'd poured the concrete. They had to be made by the people who lived in it. Meg articulated this directly. You designed this space, she said, but we've all been sustaining it. Tomas keeps the air flowing. Diane monitors our health. Nolan does the physical work that you and I aren't strong enough for. Yara, she paused. Yara is the reason we care about what happens next. The decision about whether we engage with Ward's group is a collective decision, not yours. She was right, and the recognition stung more than I expected. I'd been operating as the bunker's architect, its owner, its decision-maker. I'd consulted the others, listened to them, valued their input. But I'd retained final authority because the space was mine, because I'd built it, because my name was on the deed to a warehouse that no longer existed within any functioning legal system. That authority was fictional. It was sustained entirely by the group's willingness to grant it. And Meg was telling me, gently but without ambiguity, that the grant was conditional. We voted. The first real vote we'd held. The question was whether to establish formal contact with Ward's settlement on terms we defined ourselves. Diane voted yes. Her reasoning was medical and social. Isolation was sustainable for weeks, not years. And the skills we lacked, surgical capability, dental care, psychological support, existed in a group of 32. Nolan voted no. He didn't elaborate beyond what he'd already said. His face was closed and his arms were folded, and his vote was the vote of a man who had survived by keeping his world small. Tomas voted yes, to everyone's surprise. The air system needs parts I can't fabricate, he said. The HEPA filters have a lifespan. The battery bank will degrade. If we don't have supply relationships, the bunker has an expiration date. Everything does. It was the most he'd said at once since I'd known him, and the room was quiet when he finished. Meg voted yes. With conditions, she added. We control information flow. They don't visit here. We meet on neutral ground or at their site. The bunker's location stays approximate, not precise. And any trade agreement is reevaluated every 30 days. I voted last. I voted yes. And I did it with the nauseating awareness that I was voting to share something I'd built alone with people I couldn't predict, in a world where the rules I'd understood no longer applied. The vote was 4-1. Nolan accepted it without argument, which was its own form of grace. Yara, who had been sitting on the floor drawing pictures of lettuce plants, looked up and said, "Are we going to have neighbors?" "Something like that," Diane said. "Good," Yara said. "I want to show someone my garden." I looked at the hydroponic trays, the green rows of lettuce and radish and basil that Yara tended every day with the seriousness of a child who'd been given her first real responsibility. She'd kept a growth chart on the wall with colored pencil. A line for each plant, rising incrementally, measured with a ruler Nolan had given her. The chart was the most human document in the bunker, more human than Meg's schedules or my engineering notes or the camera footage I'd been recording. It was the record of something thriving in a place that was designed for mere preservation, and it had been made by a 6-year-old whose mother carried her out of a hospital while the air itself turned against them. Yara's garden. That was what tipped me. Not the logistics or the medicine or the HEPA filters. The fact that she wanted to show someone. The fact that survival without witness was just a slower form of disappearing. The first meeting with Ward's group happened on day 35, at a midpoint location Meg selected, an empty gas station 3 miles south of the warehouse. Meg, Diane, and I represented our side. Ward brought 2 people, a woman named Suki, who managed their food production, and a quiet man named Ellison, who appeared to be Ward's operational second. The negotiation lasted 2 hours and established a framework that Meg had drafted the night before. We would supply technical expertise, Tomas's electrical knowledge, Diane's medical training, in exchange for bulk supplies, spare parts, and access to their growing network of scavenging routes. No personnel exchanges, no residential visits, all meetings at the neutral site, scheduled in advance, confirmed by walkie-talkie on a designated frequency. Ward agreed to everything without pushback, which made me more suspicious, not less. People who agree easily are either genuinely collaborative or strategically patient, and I didn't yet know which Ward was. But the terms were protective enough that Meg was satisfied, and Meg's satisfaction was the most reliable metric I had. The first trade happened on day 38. We sent Diane to the fairground to treat a child with a respiratory infection. A grim irony, a respiratory therapist saving a child's lungs in a world where the air itself carried extinction. She returned with 2 replacement HEPA filters, a 50-pound bag of wheat flour, and a hand-drawn card from the child she'd treated, addressed to the underground doctor. Tomas installed the filters that evening. The air quality in the bunker improved measurably within hours, a crispness that I felt in my sinuses before I saw it in the oximeter readings. He stood beside the filtration unit and put his hand on the housing the way a mechanic touches an engine that's finally running right. The second trade was mine. I drove to the fairground on day 42 and spent 6 hours helping their workshop team design a solar heating system for their water supply. Ward walked me through their compound during a break, and I saw things I hadn't noticed on my first visit. A school tent where 4 children sat in a circle while a retired teacher read aloud, a bulletin board with handwritten notices, work schedules, a lost and found list, a sign-up sheet for a communal dinner, a woman sitting alone on a bench, weeping quietly, while another woman sat beside her with a hand on her back. Normal human things. The wreckage and the repair happening simultaneously, the way they always do. I came home and sat in the main living area and told Meg about the school tent. She listened, then said, "Yara should go." Nolan, who was within earshot, said nothing. But the next morning he asked me in the tone of someone who'd been arguing with himself all night, "How far is it exactly?" "The fairground. 22 minutes by truck." He nodded slowly. "If something happens while she's there, then there are 32 people to protect her instead of 5. He sat with that. I watched him turn it over, weigh it against every protective instinct he'd built over 5 decades, and arrive at a conclusion that visibly cost him something. He said, "But I drive her. Every time." Nolan's concession was the moment the bunker changed, not structurally. The concrete walls and the steel hatches and the Italian tile were the same. But its identity shifted. It stopped being a sealed refuge and became a node, connected, cautiously, conditionally, to something larger. The hatch still locked from the inside. The route to the surface still required 2 steel doors and a deliberate choice. But the choice was now being made regularly, in both directions, by people who had decided that sealed was not the same as safe, and that luxury was not the same as life. The grow lights hummed. The lettuce reached 6 inches. Yara measured it and added a green line to her chart that stretched higher than all the others. Winter came slowly to central Ohio, the cold settling into the warehouse like a tenant who intended to stay. 60 feet below, the bunker held at a constant 68 degrees. The air clean, the circadian panels cycling through their invented seasons. We'd entered a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like habitation, meals, maintenance, garden tending. The twice-weekly drive to the fairground that Nolan now made without complaint and occasionally with something approaching anticipation. I still recorded everything. The camera's memory card was half full. Hours of footage. System checks, Yara's growth charts, Diane explaining viral dormancy, Tomas calibrating equipment in total silence, Meg reviewing logistics with a pencil behind her ear, Nolan laughing at his own story for the 100th time, an archive of 6 people becoming a household inside a shell I'd built for one. The bunker was finished now. Every tile laid, every system tested, The leather couch still absurd. Still the most comfortable surface underground. Still the place where Yara fell asleep every evening while Diane hummed something I never recognized. I built it to disappear. It became the place where I was finally, irreversibly, found.